What if the most terrifying tanks of the Third Reich, the Tigers, the pride of Hitler's war machine, were not destroyed in battle at all? What if they were abandoned in perfect condition, their crews fleeing on foot, not because of enemy fire, not because of broken parts, but because the greatest army in Europe ran out of gas? It sounds impossible. It sounds absurd. But in December 1944, that's exactly what happened. Picture it. The dead of night in the Ardennes forest, snow crunching under boots, breath freezing midair. Jochen Peiper, one of Hitler's youngest and most ruthless commanders, sits inside his lead Tiger tank, preparing to spearhead Germany's last great offensive. Around him growls a column of steel, 60 tanks, nearly 5,000 men, an armored fist meant to punch straight through the American lines and split the Allies in two. This was supposed to be Hitler's masterstroke. The propaganda promised shock, speed, and victory. But as the column rolled forward, something unthinkable happened. One tank coughed, sputtered, and died. Then another. Then another. Within minutes, the most feared armored spearhead in Europe was paralyzed, silent, immobile, helpless, not because of enemy fire, but because the fuel had run dry. And then, as if by divine intervention, salvation appeared. An American supply depot, abandoned in panic. Fires still burning in barrels, tin mugs of coffee left half full and spread out before them like treasure, mountains of olive-drab jerry cans, 50,000 gallons of high-octane gasoline, enough to power Peiper's entire division to the moose. The men cheered. They wept. They thought destiny itself had handed them victory. But Peiper knew better. If the Americans could afford to abandon oceans of fuel without blinking, Germany had already lost. This was not a war of courage anymore. It was a war of logistics. And against America's endless rivers of oil, the Reich never stood a chance. 6 months earlier, Albert Speer had already placed the numbers in front of Hitler. They told a story no propaganda could erase. Germany's synthetic fuel output, once the lifeblood of Blitzkrieg, was collapsing. Allied bombers had turned Leuna and Berlin into twisted skeletons. In April 1944, production reached 175,000 tons. By September, just 5,000. The Luftwaffe grounded pilots not for lack of courage, but lack of octane. Cadets who once trained with 200 flight hours now managed 60. Tank battalions learned to shut down engines at every halt. Civilians plowed fields with horses again, their tractors silent. The Reich was still shouting slogans of destiny, but its veins were empty. And yet Hitler rolled the dice. The Ardennes offensive was a plan written on desperation. Antwerp, he promised, would fall. The Allies would split. America's resolve would crumble. But baked into the orders was insanity. There was fuel enough for half the journey. The rest must be stolen. The strategy was not victory. It was theft. And every officer knew it. On December 16, 1944, the curtain rose. At 5:30 a.m., the ground shook under the weight of artillery. 2 hours of thunder rolled across the forest, consuming shells faster than Germany could ever replace them. Then, the armored spearhead lurched forward. Tigers, panthers, half-tracks crawling through narrow Ardennes lanes that looked like highways on German maps, but felt like goat paths under steel tracks. Vehicles jammed, engines wasted liters idling. Soldiers cursed frostbitten fingers as they pushed stalled trucks off the road. At Lanzerath, just 18 American reconnaissance men dug in behind a hedgerow. 18 men against thousands. And still, they held for nearly 10 hours. German engines sat running, their needles ticking down, gallons lost to stillness. A corporal later recalled, "We sat in our Tiger, counting the minutes. Every minute meant fuel gone, and we hadn't moved an inch." By the time Peiper's Kampfgruppe broke through, they had advanced only 20 miles. 40% of their fuel was gone. Antwerp lay 65 miles ahead. The mathematics were poison. That night, the forest froze again. Men scraped frost from windshields with bayonets. Some tanks refused to start in the morning. Others rumbled forward only to cough and stall. Then came the miracle at Hansfeld. 50,000 gallons waiting like a gift. Soldiers shouted with joy, tore open cans, splashed gasoline into Maybach engines that had been starved for months. For a moment, it felt like destiny had bent toward them. But Peiper was silent. He walked among the stacks, his boots crunching ice, his breath fogging in the morning light. He counted rows, whispered calculations, and felt the weight in his chest. 50,000 gallons. Enough to move forward. Enough for a day, maybe two. But nothing compared to the oceans the Americans commanded. A private rifled through papers in the depot office. Shipping manifests. The words leapt off the page. Texas to New York to Liverpool, across the Channel to Normandy, trucked 400 miles inland, all in 6 weeks. He showed the manifest to his commander. Peiper read it twice, then crushed the paper in his fist. He said nothing, but his face told the truth. Germany was fighting not soldiers, but an empire of oil. And as his column lurched forward again, tracks biting snow and engines roaring with borrowed fuel, Peiper saw it, a black plume rising above the trees to the west. At Stavelot, American engineers had already made their decision. They would burn millions rather than let him touch a drop. The smoke appeared first, a column of black clawing into the winter sky. At Stavelot, the promise of salvation turned into an inferno. The depot had been one of Peiper's prime objectives, more than 2 million gallons stacked across acres of ground, enough to carry his spearhead not just to the Meuse, but all the way to Antwerp, enough to buy the Reich a miracle. But when the first German vehicles crested the ridge, they found hell waiting. American engineers, warned of the approach, had poured gasoline trails between the stacks and primed phosphorus grenades. At 16:30, Captain John Brewster of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion gave a simple order: deny fuel to the enemy. The explosion was instant. A wall of flame roared into the sky, so tall it made men shield their faces from miles away. Gasoline thundered as it ignited, columns of jerry cans erupting like volcanoes. The fire devoured the depot in hours, but the black smoke lingered for days. German soldiers stood at a distance, their mouths open, watching 2 million gallons, more than their entire division had been allocated for the offensive, vanish into the sky. A young officer muttered, "They burn what we would guard with our lives." Another soldier spat into the snow. But the truth settled on every face. If America could destroy oceans of fuel without hesitation, what chance did Germany have? And it wasn't just Stavelot. Across the Ardennes, American engineers were torching depots before Germans could reach them. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons. At Trois Ponts, 1.1 million. In a single week, the U.S. Army deliberately destroyed more than 8 million gallons, almost twice what Hitler had assigned to the entire Ardennes gamble. Peiper's men refueled at Hansfeld and pushed forward, but they could not outrun the mathematics. A Tiger tank consumed 2.5 gallons per mile in combat. Panthers drank 1.5. Trucks guzzled whatever scraps remained. In the difficult terrain, consumption rose by 40%. By noon on December 18th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe had burned through 67,000 gallons. They had captured perhaps 55,000. They were operating at a deficit. Meanwhile, American clerks scribbled in neat ledgers. Fuel receipts yesterday won 847,000 gallons. Fuel issued won the 623,000. Net gain to reserves, 224,000. The casual arithmetic of abundance. One side celebrated the capture of 50,000 gallons as a miracle. The other grumbled when bad weather reduced deliveries below 2 million. The contrast was brutal. The Germans lived in scarcity, counting every liter. The Americans lived in excess, measuring by the million. A private in Peiper's column found a discarded Stars and Stripes newspaper dated December 15th. The headline announced the opening of a new fuel pipeline from Cherbourg to Verdun. 300,000 gallons a day. A single pipeline delivering more fuel daily than Peiper's entire division would use in its offensive. He folded the paper into his coat and later wrote, "That was the moment I understood we weren't fighting soldiers anymore. We were fighting their supply lines, and their supply lines were endless." Behind the front, the Red Ball Express thundered day and night. 6,000 trucks, color-coded routes round the clock, eating more gasoline, delivering supplies, than Germany's Army Group B received in a month. Each truck consumed 40 gallons daily. The operation itself would have paralyzed the Wehrmacht. For America, it was a routine solved by mechanics, dispatchers, and an ocean of fuel. The pipelines were even more terrifying. Operation Pluto, pipeline under the ocean, fed a network that pulsed gasoline beneath the English Channel, pumping 1 million gallons daily from Britain into France. From there, lines ran like arteries into the continent. Cherbourg to Paris, 800,000 gallons daily. Senlis, 650,000. By December 1944, Allied forces in Northwest Europe consumed 7.5 million gallons per day and still increased reserves. Peiper had been given 31,000 gallons to start his push. He knew the numbers. He had even ordered his crews to shut down engines at halts longer than 5 minutes. And yet, when he watched American engineers burn 2 million gallons in an afternoon, he realized the scale of the mismatch. "We are counting drops," he whispered to an aide. "They are drowning in oceans." German officers tried to rally the men. They told them the Americans were desperate, that the flames proved panic. But soldiers were not fools. They saw American trucks moving supplies at all hours. They saw Allied aircraft filling the skies again once the weather cleared. On December 23rd, when the fog lifted, 2,000 sorties flew in a single day, each fighter consuming 300 gallons an hour. In one afternoon, American aircraft burned more fuel than Peiper's Kampfgruppe had captured since the offensive began. Captured German diaries tell the same story, disbelief turning to despair. One corporal wrote, "At Hansfeld, we thought we had been saved. At Stavelot, we learned we were finished." Another scribbled, "Your soldiers waste more fuel heating coffee than we are given for entire operations." As Peiper pushed deeper into Belgium, the noose tightened. Reports came in. Convoys destroyed, depots gone, no resupply possible. Tanks began to stall. Crews siphoned gasoline from wrecks to keep a handful moving. By December 20th, Peiper had perhaps 8,000 gallons left, enough for one engagement or one retreat, but not both. At a field briefing, one of his officers asked, "Herr Obersturmbannführer, what happens if we reach the Meuse with no fuel?" Peiper stared into the snow, then answered quietly, "Then we walk back." But the worst revelation was yet to come, because fuel was only the first window into America's impossible abundance. Ahead lay even greater shocks, in stockyards with meat enough to feed an army, factories producing bombers every hour, cities glowing with lights while Germany starved in darkness. Peiper's men thought they had seen the scale of the enemy at Stavelot. In truth, they had only glimpsed the surface. On the morning of December 19th, the truth of the Ardennes offensive began to reveal itself not in battle, reports, but in the silence of abandoned machines. Along the narrow Belgian roads, panthers and tigers sat like stranded beasts, their hulks black against the snow. Some had been drained dry by their own crews, siphoning the last drops into another vehicle. Others had simply been left where they stopped, their tracks frozen into ice. A German sergeant later recalled, "It was like watching our strength rot before our eyes. Perfect tanks, weapons intact, crews ready, and nothing to move them." Peiper's column pressed on with what fuel remained, but each mile demanded sacrifice. Crews cannibalized their own. A panther was drained to feed a tiger. A half-track surrendered its last leaders so an artillery piece could move another kilometer. Soldiers marched beside machines that once symbolized unstoppable power. The propaganda image of German armor was cracking under the weight of mathematics. And still, the Americans seemed to move effortlessly. The Red Ball Express thundered across France and Belgium. Convoys of 6,000 trucks, headlights blacked out, drivers navigating by memory and colored markers nailed to trees. They moved day and night, bringing 12,500 tons of supplies every 24 hours. Each truck guzzled 40 gallons of gasoline a day, more than many German companies received for entire operations. One captured diary from a German lieutenant describes watching the convoys. "We counted trucks for 2 hours, and they did not stop. Every truck full, every truck moving. I realized then that their supply line was an army in itself, bigger than ours at the front." The contrast cut deeper in the small details. German soldiers rationed cigarettes like gold. American GIs tossed half-smoked Lucky Strikes into the snow without a thought. Germans went hungry for weeks on watery soup and black bread. American mess kits overflowed with meat, potatoes, chocolate. Prisoners taken in the Ardennes stared in disbelief at their captors' rations. One wrote later, "They ate meat as we ate bread. They ate bread as we wished we could." Even the trash told the story. A German scavenged from discarded American ration boxes, stunned to find untouched cans of fruit, candy, and coffee grounds. "They throw away more than we have seen in years," a corporal muttered. "They live in waste, and still they fight stronger than us." By December 20th, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was deep in Belgium but nearly out of fuel. Reports came in, convoys destroyed by Allied aircraft, depots burned, reserves gone. Peiper consolidated his remaining 8,000 gallons, enough for one action, an attack or a retreat, not both. At a tense staff meeting, his officers argued. One proposed a push forward, gambling that another depot could be seized. Another insisted on retreat before encirclement. Peiper listened in silence. Then he said, "We have discovered we are not fighting men, but supply lines. Their fuel is everywhere, ours is nowhere. Victory is no longer possible." But orders from above demanded advance, not withdrawal, and so the tanks crawled on, each mile burning away Germany's future. American intelligence knew. Ultra intercepts revealed Peiper's desperation. General Courtney Hodges ordered all units. Enemy critically short of fuel, destroy every gallon threatened by capture. The Americans obeyed with ruthless efficiency. More depots went up in flames. At Trois Ponts, engineers poured trails of gasoline and lit them with phosphorus grenades. At Spa, 2.5 million gallons roared skyward. The sky turned black with smoke, visible for miles. German soldiers watched in stunned silence. One private wrote home, "They destroy oceans to deny us a cup. We cannot fight this." Morale cracked. Even fanatical SS veterans grew quiet. Letters that survived censorship reveal the despair. A young officer wrote to his wife, "The Americans drive tanks as we march on foot. They burn what we cannot even dream to possess. I no longer believe in victory." For the men in Peiper's column, the psychological collapse was more devastating than any battlefield defeat. They had been told Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of sacrifice. Yet here they saw Americans not only fight, but fight with such abundance they could waste millions and never notice. The myth of German superiority dissolved in the smoke of burning fuel. By December 21st, Peiper was surrounded near L'Église. Tanks sat idle, crews shivering inside empty hulls, waiting for orders that could not be carried out. American forces closed in, the 82nd Airborne, the 30th Infantry, the 3rd Armored. Each of those divisions had fuel allocations of hundreds of thousands of gallons for that single day. Peiper had less than 1,000. American soldiers joked in letters home, "We've got Germans trapped who ran out of gas. Our captain says we use more fuel making coffee than they have for tanks." It wasn't far from the truth. The symbolism was devastating. The Tiger tank, once the icon of German dominance, reduced to a frozen hulk abandoned in a Belgian village. American GIs climbed on them for photographs, laughing, smoking, mugging for the camera. The images told the story more than any report. The Reich's strongest weapon defeated not by firepower, but by an empty tank of fuel. And the final irony? For America, the offensive barely scratched reserves. While German divisions collapsed for want of a few thousand gallons, American planners were already approving requests for 245 million gallons for the next month's operations. The papers were stamped without debate. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. Even if Germany won a battle in the Ardennes, the war was already lost. Courage, training, fanaticism, it all meant nothing against an enemy who fought with oceans of oil. For the men of Peiper's Kampfgruppe, the shock did not end with burning fuel depots. The deeper they moved into Belgium, the more they saw glimpses of a world that shattered every story they had been told about America. On the night of December 21st, their trains of prisoners were marched through small towns. German soldiers expected poverty and ruin. Propaganda had drilled into them that America was weak, a land of strikes and unemployment. Instead, they saw shop windows blazing with electric light, signs glowing in neon, streets lit brighter than Berlin before the blackout orders. "Every small town had more electricity than all of Hamburg," one officer muttered. A corporal wrote in his diary, "We marched through cities where every house had lights in 2 or 3 rooms. They burned electricity like water. In Germany, we live in darkness. Here, even the baker's shop shines like a palace." In railway yards, they saw workers moving with machines Germans did not believe existed. Coal loaded by conveyor belts, water pumped by electricity, cars serviced by mechanized lifts. One prisoner, an electrical engineer before the war, calculated that a single American railway yard used more power in an hour than his entire Berlin district consumed in a day. "The waste was magnificent," he later wrote. Fans turned in empty rooms, lights burned in vacant halls. They lived as though resources were infinite. And then there was food. At captured stockyards near Kansas City, German prisoners stared in disbelief at thousands of cattle waiting for slaughter. The smell of meat packing filled the air for miles. Men who had subsisted on thin rations of black bread and turnip soup watched American workers eat beef sandwiches on their lunch breaks. One prisoner whispered, "They eat meat as we wish we could eat bread." At a station stop, an American guard casually bought 20 hamburgers for his men. He handed over a $1 bill and didn't even glance at the change. A German private later wrote home, "In that moment, I understood the war was lost. They eat like kings while we fight on crumbs. Their money buys in minutes what we starve for weeks to earn." Letters and diaries capture the disbelief. One soldier described watching an American guard stub out a half-smoked cigarette, then light another immediately. "That one gesture," he wrote, "was worth 1,000 propaganda speeches. We scrape for butts in the gutter. They waste tobacco as if it were dirt." Factories delivered the next blow. Prisoners passing by Ford's Willow Run plant outside Detroit saw a building that stretched for miles, its windows glowing even at midnight. They were told it produced a B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. We had been told American planes were inferior, hastily built, one Luftwaffe pilot recalled. But I could see with my own eyes. These were no toys. They were machines of war produced faster than we could imagine possible. Another chemist, captured at Stavelot, recognized the towering distillation columns of synthetic rubber plants near Louisville. Each facility was larger than anything in Germany, he wrote in a post-war interview. And there were 4 of them, side by side. We had struggled for years to produce 120,000 tons of synthetic rubber. Here, they produced 800,000 tons annually and treated it as ordinary. The realization crept in slowly, then all at once. Nazi ideology had painted America as decadent, lazy, incapable of unity. But everywhere these prisoners looked, they saw abundance, order, and strength. Workers wore boots that would cost a German laborer 2 months' wages. Children drank milk every day while German families rationed bread. Ordinary farmers owned cars, tractors, refrigerators, luxuries reserved for party elites in Germany. One farmer's son from Bavaria wrote, "The American boy of 16 drives a tractor worth more than everything my father earned in his life. When I told him this, he laughed and said it wasn't even a good tractor. His family was waiting for a new one." The more they saw, the more silent they became. Men who once shouted slogans about German destiny now muttered about American power. Even fanatics struggled to maintain the illusion. A lieutenant confided in his journal, "We were told America was mongrel, weak, a land of Jews and Negroes. Yet here, Negroes operate complex machinery. Women weld steel, teenagers run drilling equipment, and the production never stops. Everything we believed was a lie." For Peiper's men, the humiliation cut deeper with every mile. They had begun the offensive believing themselves superior, heirs to a 1,000-year Reich. Now, surrounded by oceans of abundance, they felt like peasants staring into a future that left them behind. An officer remembered the moment vividly. "We realized even if we won a battle, we had already lost the war. You cannot fight numbers. You cannot fight factories. You cannot fight a nation that throws away more than you possess." By the end of December, Peiper's Kampfgruppe was trapped, encircled at L'Église. With fuel gone and supplies exhausted, they destroyed their own tanks rather than let Americans capture them. Flames licked at the steel monsters once hailed as invincible. Soldiers walked back through snow, leaving behind millions of marks of equipment reduced to useless shells. But the story did not end there. For many Germans, captivity in America would deliver the final, most devastating blow. Not just to their armies, but to their minds. Because if burning depots and glowing cities were shocking, what came next would be unthinkable, the kindness of their enemies. Christmas came to the camps like a whisper, then exploded into something the German prisoners could not comprehend. By December 1943, thousands of captured soldiers were already scattered across America, Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Iowa. For men raised on tales of American decadence, every day in captivity was an education. But nothing prepared them for Christmas. In Camp Hearn, Texas, prisoners woke to the sound of carols drifting across the wire. A Methodist choir from town had come to sing Stille Nacht, in German, voices carrying through frosted air. Soldiers pressed against fences, their eyes wide. Women from town had baked cookies, wrapped them in paper, and sent them to men who had been their enemies weeks before. The Boy Scouts of Hearn delivered handmade Christmas cards to men who had once tried to kill their fathers. A corporal wrote, "They knew we were their enemies. They had sons fighting against us. And still, they sent cakes, songs, kindness. I felt something break inside me. We were told Americans were weak. Instead, they showed us strength greater than fear." Packages arrived by the hundreds of thousands. American churches, civic groups, and even schools had sent Christmas gifts: cigarettes, candy, toiletries, books. At Camp Shelby, a German officer unwrapped a box containing a pipe and tobacco. "It felt like a dream," he wrote. "Our families at home were starving, cold, afraid. And here, our enemies gave us more than our government ever had." The feast defied belief. Prisoners sat to plates piled high with turkey, ham, mashed potatoes, gravy, vegetables, pies, ice cream. Men ate until they were sick, unaccustomed to such abundance. One Feldwebel wept as he pushed away his plate. "We ate better as prisoners than our generals in Germany," he later admitted. "Better than party leaders, better than anyone at home." An American guard explained, almost apologetically, "This isn't special. It's just Christmas dinner. Every family in America is eating this tonight." The words cut deeper than any insult. If this was ordinary, what did it say about the Reich's 1,000-year destiny? The psychological shock was immense. German soldiers had been raised on Nazi racial theory, taught that Americans were mongrels, lazy, incapable of sacrifice. But here they saw Christian charity extended even to enemies. It wasn't propaganda, it was real. Women handed over homemade cakes. Children waved to men in uniforms that had once bombed their cities. One lieutenant confessed in a letter home, carefully worded to pass censors. They told us America was built on lies. Yet these people live with abundance and still show mercy. What kind of strength is this, that even hatred cannot shake? Dr. Friedrich Bauer, a captured military surgeon, was stunned to see camp hospitals stocked with equipment Germany hadn't seen since 1941. X-ray machines, surgical supplies, even penicillin, used freely, even on minor prisoner infections. "Our soldiers died for want of aspirin," he wrote bitterly. "Here they treat us with miracles." Food was another revelation. In kitchens, German cooks discovered refrigerators larger than their entire barracks, dishwashers powered by electricity, mixers that churned dough for thousands. Regulations required preparing 10% more food than needed, so every day, untouched surplus was thrown away. A prisoner chef wrote in his diary, "Today we discarded more bread than my family saw in 3 years. I wept as I carried good loaves to the garbage." Even more disturbing was the casualness with which Americans extended kindness. It wasn't staged, it wasn't even organized in many cases. Farmers who used German laborers invited them into homes for meals. Children gave them apples from lunchboxes. At Christmas, one Nebraska family set an extra place at their table for the enemy worker who had been picking beets in their fields. "They treated me as a guest," he remembered. "Not a prisoner, a guest." For many, this was the moment ideology collapsed. A young officer wrote later, "We had been told democracy was chaos, that only tyranny brought order. Yet in this land, democracy produced abundance, and tyranny produced ashes. We believed we were bringing civilization to the world. Instead, it was shown to us by those we called enemies." The Special Projects Division, America's secret re-education unit, watched carefully. Reports from December 1943 note, "Prisoners are no longer argumentative when shown production statistics. They have seen too much. Even the most fanatical Nazis grow quiet. Many openly ask for American newspapers, books, classes. Indeed, camp newspapers began shifting tone." At Fort Kearny, Der Ruf, once filled with nationalist rhetoric, now published essays on democracy, economics, even philosophy. Anti-Nazi prisoners were placed in editorial roles, but what stunned American monitors was how receptive their fellow Germans became. Discussions about constitutional rights, free markets, and post-war reconstruction flourished where once there had been only slogans. And all of it, every shift, every ideological crack, had been achieved not through beatings, not through threats, but through abundance and dignity. One soldier later wrote, "We were conquered not by bullets, but by refrigerators, not by bombs, but by bread, not by propaganda, but by Christmas." For the Americans, it was routine generosity. For the Germans, it was shattering. If enemies could be treated with such mercy, what did that say about everything they had been taught? And the cracks widened with every passing day, because after Christmas came the greatest revelation of all, that this mercy, this abundance, was not temporary. It was the foundation of American life. Factories, farms, universities, all waiting to be revealed. After the shock of Christmas, the German prisoners waited for the curtain to fall, convinced it had all been a momentary gesture. Surely the kindness would vanish. Surely the abundance would turn to scarcity, but it did not. Instead, it deepened. By early 1944, American authorities launched one of the most unusual experiments of the war. Re-education through exposure, not coercion. It began with small things, German-language newspapers, printed in the camps. At first, they carried simple stories, camp events, schedules, Red Cross announcements. But within months, something remarkable happened. Prisoners themselves began writing. Anti-Nazi editors filled pages with essays about democracy, history, even philosophy. At Fort Kearny, Rhode Island, the newspaper Der Ruf shifted from thinly veiled nationalism to open discussion of post-war reconstruction. Topics once unthinkable, freedom of speech, individual rights, economic systems, were debated in German, read by thousands of prisoners who only months earlier had sworn loyalty to Hitler. One lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We argued in our barracks about things we never spoke of at home. Could Germany ever be free without tyranny? Could democracy bring order? In Germany, to ask these questions was treason. Here, it was encouraged." The Americans encouraged learning with a relentlessness that mirrored their logistics. By spring, over 40,000 prisoners were enrolled in courses. Universities provided textbooks. Professors volunteered to teach. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, lectures on American history and constitutional law were delivered in German. At Camp Swift, Texas, prisoners studied mathematics, agriculture, even atomic physics. Dr. Wilhelm von Braun, a physicist conscripted from the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute, later recalled attending lectures on quantum mechanics delivered by Jewish refugee professors. "They taught us as equals," he said. "We had been raised to see Jews as subhuman, yet here they stood at chalkboards explaining science beyond our reach, with patience and dignity. It was not weakness, it was strength, the strength of knowledge freely shared. The hunger for books grew insatiable. Camp libraries held thousands of volumes. Shakespeare, Goethe, Thomas Paine, Franklin Roosevelt's speeches, all available. Prisoners who had only ever read censored propaganda devoured works of history, science, literature. For the first time in my life, one wrote, I read multiple newspapers and compared their views. In Germany, one paper told us what to think. Here, 3 papers argued, and the truth was somewhere between. It was dizzying. It was intoxicating. And then there were the films. Every week, camp theaters showed American movies, not propaganda, but the same films American civilians watched. The prisoners saw Gone with the Wind, The Grapes of Wrath, comedies, romances, even war stories. They were stunned. A lieutenant wrote, "In Germany, films exist only to glorify the Reich. Here, the Americans show their own suffering. They show poverty, injustice, even failure. And yet the people cheer. They are not ashamed. They are not afraid. They believe their strength lies in admitting their flaws. We could never imagine such a thing." For many, it was the final crack in the myth of Nazi superiority. A soldier confessed in a censored letter, "They hide nothing. They criticize themselves, openly. And yet they grow stronger. In Germany, to speak against the Reich is death. Here, to speak against the president is patriotism." The change was visible even to guards. A camp monitor reported, "The most fanatical men no longer argue. They sit quietly during lectures. They write in notebooks. They ask for English dictionaries." Education became not just a pastime, but a lifeline. Men who had come to America as conquerors left as students. They learned democracy not from slogans, but from lived experience. Debate in mess halls, fairness in court-like hearings, lectures from professors who treated them with dignity. One sergeant who attended a civics course wrote, "We were told democracy was weakness. Instead, I saw men who trusted one another without fear. We were told only force could bind a people. Instead, I saw abundance born of freedom. I began to think, maybe we were the slaves, not them." The Americans understood what was happening. Major Paul Newland, part of the Special Projects Division, wrote in December 1943, "The prisoners no longer speak of victory. They ask about democracy. They ask about jobs after the war. They ask how to rebuild." For some, the transformation was so complete it frightened even their captors. Reports note prisoners requesting to remain in America after the war. Others married American women through correspondence programs. Tens of thousands asked for vocational training, agriculture, mechanics, industry, so they could carry knowledge home. But perhaps the most powerful moments were the smallest. A soldier reading an American newspaper aloud to his barracks, pausing at an editorial criticizing Roosevelt. The room falling silent, someone whispering, "Imagine writing this about Hitler." Or evenings in the camp theater, where hardened SS veterans sat weeping quietly during the Grapes of Wrath, realizing the Americans dared show their poor on screen, yet still grew stronger as a nation. One officer later testified, "That honesty was the final blow. They feared nothing, not even truth. We feared everything." By early 1944, the ideological collapse was nearly complete. The Germans still wore uniforms, still marched when ordered, still dreamed of home. But inside, they knew the Reich had told them America was weak. Their own eyes had told them otherwise. And then came June 1944. The news that would seal the coffin on Hope, Normandy, D-Day, the site of 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 men landing in a single day. The scale of logistics turned into a weapon so vast it defied imagination. For prisoners who had already seen America's abundance, the invasion was not just another battle. It was confirmation that the war was over. The rumors spread through the camps like wildfire. At first, men dismissed them. Another Allied bluff, another fantasy conjured by propaganda. But on June 6, 1944, the truth could no longer be ignored. The Americans and their allies had crossed the Channel. Normandy was burning with the greatest invasion in history. The numbers alone were annihilating. 6,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft, 150,000 men in the first wave alone, and behind them, millions more waiting to follow. Prisoners who had seen America's trucks, depots, and factories now watched newsreels showing an armada stretching to the horizon. For them, it was not just an invasion. It was the physical embodiment of everything they had already learned. This war was over. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, prisoners were marched to the theater. The reels rolled. Endless streams of ships, artificial harbors rising from the sea, convoys unloading supplies at a speed Germans could not fathom. A sergeant whispered, "This is no army. This is a continent moving." Another wrote in his diary, "I saw them building harbors out of nothing. Harbors. In Germany, we take months to repair a bridge. They built harbors in the ocean. How can we fight such people?" The silence after the screenings was heavier than any speech. Guards reported prisoners returning to barracks, pale, quiet, shaken. Men who once swore to die for Hitler now sat staring at the floor. One officer muttered, "We sent horses against their trucks, rifles against their planes, courage against their factories. We were fools." Back in Europe, Peiper's own Kampfgruppe had already lived this reality. By December 1944, his tanks were running dry, abandoned on frozen Belgian roads. Soldiers marched through snow, leaving behind millions of marks of machinery rendered useless by empty fuel tanks. It was like tearing out our own hearts, one survivor recalled. Perfect tigers, perfect panthers, and all we could do was walk away. American soldiers laughed, climbing atop abandoned tanks for photographs. A GI wrote home, "They call them super weapons, but we beat them with nothing more than a lack of gas." The humiliation cut deeper than defeat in battle. German pride had been built on steel, speed, mechanized might. And now, the Reich's greatest weapons lay rusting in ditches, useless not from enemy shells, but from mathematics. Letters from prisoners reveal the despair. A corporal confessed, "At first we believed the invasion was propaganda. Then we saw the pictures. Then we remembered the trucks, the food, the light in their towns. Everything matched. We were never their equals." Even fanatics began to falter. A lieutenant who once lectured fellow prisoners about racial superiority now wrote privately, "They told us Americans were mongrels. Yet these mongrels have more tanks, more planes, more food, more everything. If this is weakness, then what is strength?" The Americans, for their part, did not gloat. Guards answered questions calmly, sometimes even with sympathy. One Texan sergeant told a German prisoner, "We don't hate you. We're fighting Hitler. The sooner he's gone, the sooner you can go. Home." The German, stunned, asked, "And you will not destroy us?" The sergeant shrugged. "We'll help rebuild. You'll see." It sounded like madness, yet the prisoners were already seeing hints of it. Vocational training expanded. Courses in agriculture, mechanics, and business filled camp schedules. Men who once marched under swastikas now learned how to repair tractors, manage farms, run factories. "They are preparing us to rebuild," one officer noted bitterly, "not to perish." The irony was unbearable. At home, German cities smoldered under bombs. Families rationed every crumb. Yet here, enemy prisoners learned English, studied democracy, read books banned in Germany. They were being given tools their own regime denied them. For many, the contrast was too much. A prisoner wrote in a smuggled note, "I believed in Hitler until I saw America. Now I see only lies. He promised us 1,000 years. He gave us rubble. They promised nothing, yet they live in abundance." Normandy sealed the coffin. The sight of entire divisions landing in a single day, supplied as if by magic, proved what every captured soldier already feared. Germany was not fighting an army, but an industrial civilization. At Camp Swift, an SS officer who had once sneered at democracy stood before his barracks after watching a newsreel. "Comrades," he said quietly, "there is no point in denial. We are finished. Our victory was never possible." No one argued. No one cheered. The silence of agreement was more powerful than any speech. Back in Europe, American forces drove forward with unstoppable momentum. German prisoners listened to guards talk about fuel requests, millions of gallons approved without hesitation. They heard of Red Ball convoys consuming more fuel in a day than entire German armies received in a month. Every statistic was another nail in the coffin. A diary entry from late June reads, "We thought D-Day was the beginning of the end, but it was only proof the end had already come." And still, worse revelations were waiting, because abundance alone could be explained away. Perhaps, prisoners thought, America was rich by chance. But when the war's true horrors emerged, the camps, the atrocities, then even pride, even loyalty, collapsed completely. By spring of 1945, defeat was no longer a possibility. It was a certainty. The German prisoners in America knew it. They had seen the numbers, the trucks, the factories, the food. They had watched D-Day unfold in newsreels. Yet even then, some clung to scraps of pride. "We may lose," one officer insisted, "but at least we fought with honor." Then the news came that ripped away even that last refuge. In April, American newspapers began printing photographs and reports from camps liberated by Allied soldiers. At first, German prisoners scoffed. "Propaganda," they muttered. "Hollywood tricks." They had been told their enemies fabricated lies. Many refused to look at the images. But the reports did not stop. More photographs, more testimonies, and then the letters. Red Cross messages, scribbled notes from family back home, confirmations whispered across oceans. The unimaginable was true. A lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We thought we were warriors. We thought we were defending civilization. Now I learn that we were the barbarians. Everything we believed, everything we fought for, is ashes." The psychological effect was devastating. Men who had survived Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Ardennes, men who had endured hunger, cold, and captivity, now broke down in silence. Guards reported prisoners sitting for hours without speaking, staring at the ground. One camp monitor wrote, "The strongest officers we had, men who never wavered, never questioned, are now the quietest. They do not argue, they do not defend, they simply sit." For many, it was not military defeat that crushed them, but moral collapse. The Reich had promised glory, destiny, civilization. Instead, it left behind evidence of crimes so vast they could not be denied. At Camp Herne, a German doctor who had once lectured others about racial purity stood before his barracks. He held a newspaper and shaking hands. "I cannot explain this," he said softly, "but I can tell you this much. We were lied to about everything." Some prisoners refused at first. "It cannot be true," they insisted. But as more evidence arrived, the resistance faltered. A private wrote home, "If even half of what they say is real, then our cause was not only doomed, it was evil." In one of the camp newspapers, the editors published an unprecedented essay. It did not use the word defeat. It used the word guilt. For the first time, German prisoners themselves admitted what had once been unthinkable. "We were not only misled, we were complicit." This acknowledgement spread like fire. Men who had once mocked American democracy now asked for Bibles, for philosophy books, for lectures on ethics. The hunger for knowledge turned into hunger for redemption. One officer wrote later, "We could accept losing battles, we could accept losing cities, but losing our honor, that was the final blow. That was when we understood that our oaths were chains, and those chains had bound us to criminals." For the Americans, it was a delicate moment. Guards offered no speeches, no triumph. They simply handed newspapers to the prisoners and walked away. The silence in the camps was heavier than any victory parade, and slowly, conversations began to change. No longer about Hitler or the Reich or even the war. Instead, prisoners debated what kind of Germany could exist after such revelations. "If this is what tyranny brings," one man said, "then perhaps democracy is not weakness after all." Major Paul Newland of the Special Projects Division wrote in May 1945, "The collapse is total, not just military, but moral. The prisoners no longer cling to illusions. They look to the future with questions they never dared ask before." The timing was fateful. As Germany itself crumbled, prisoners in America were being prepared, not for destruction, but for reconstruction. Vocational classes expanded, agricultural training accelerated, universities sent professors to lecture on rebuilding. The very men who had once marched under swastikas were now learning how to plant wheat, manage factories, and debate constitutions. One sergeant wrote in his journal, "We came here as enemies. We will leave as students. The The Americans have shown us the world we never believed existed. For many, the realization was unbearable. One SS officer confessed years later, "The hardest moment was not the battlefields. It was sitting in a camp thousands of miles away, reading newspapers, and realizing that everything we fought for had been a lie. Yet in that collapse lay the seed of something new. Men who had been warriors of the Reich now dreamed of rebuilding Germany as something different, as a democracy, as a partner, as a nation that could feed its children without conquest. But first, they had to face homecoming, and that too would bring revelations. Because the Germany they returned to was rubble, and the only tools they carried back were the lessons learned in American captivity. When the war ended in May 1945, the prisoners knew their lives would never be the same. They had entered America as warriors of the Reich, sworn to Hitler, convinced of their superiority. They would leave as witnesses to another truth, that freedom, abundance, and dignity could build more power than tyranny ever could. The repatriation began slowly. Between 1945 and 1946, ships carried hundreds of thousands of German prisoners back across the Atlantic. They returned not to the nation they remembered, but to rubble. Cities bombed flat, families scattered, railways broken. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left only ashes. But many carried something back with them that rubble could not erase. Knowledge. Knowledge of factories that worked day and night, of farms that produced more wheat in a season than Germany could in years. Of a democracy that argued openly yet grew stronger. A corporal wrote on the voyage home, "We will rebuild, not with whips, not with lies, but with what we saw there. We know now that prosperity does not come from conquest, it comes from freedom." Historians would later call it one of the most successful re-education programs in history. Without threats, without beatings, without indoctrination, simply through observation, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners became missionaries for democracy. They had seen it with their own eyes, and no propaganda could erase it. In the 1950s, when West Germany rose from the ruins in what came to be called the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle, the fingerprints of those lessons were everywhere. Farmers adopted American machinery and methods. Engineers streamlined factories with the efficiency they had witnessed. Politicians crafted institutions that echoed what prisoners had studied in American textbooks. Hans Kroll, once a prisoner at Camp Shelby, became West Germany's ambassador to Washington. Walter Hallstein, who had lectured fellow inmates about democracy, became president of the European Commission. Rudiger von Marx, held at Camp Herne, served as Germany's representative to the United Nations. Countless others became farmers, teachers, mayors, ordinary men who carried extraordinary lessons into their communities. One of them, decades later, admitted in an interview, "I learned more about freedom behind American barbed wire than I ever did in 12 years under Hitler." The transformation did not end with the 1940s. Many prisoners kept writing to the American families they had met, sending letters across the ocean for decades. Some immigrated, marrying American women, raising children who spoke both languages. By the 1980s, reunions were held in Texas, Nebraska, and Iowa, where former enemies embraced like old friends. At one such gathering in Austin, Texas, in 1985, over 500 former German prisoners returned to the land of their captivity. They walked through the old campgrounds, now empty fields. They visited the small towns whose families had once sent them Christmas cakes. They told their children, "This is where everything changed." That evening, at the reunion dinner, a former officer rose to speak. He was old now, his hair white, his voice cracked with age, but his words carried the weight of history. "We came here as conquerors," he said. "We left as students. America showed us that strength comes not from fear, but from trust, not from cruelty, but from abundance, not from tyranny, but from freedom. We learned this not from propaganda, but from life itself. Every light bulb, every loaf of bread, every act of kindness was a lesson, and those lessons built the new Germany." The room erupted in applause. Americans and Germans together, once enemies, now partners. For the prisoners, the realization had been simple but profound. The war had been lost not only on the battlefield, but in the kitchens, the farms, the railways, the factories, the classrooms. America's true weapon had not been its tanks or its planes, but its ability to create, to share, to believe. One man put it plainly. "They conquered us with refrigerators." Another, "We were defeated by light bulbs." Still another, "It was not their bombs that broke us, but their bread." Of the 371,000 Germans held in America, fewer than 1% ever attempted escape. Most rated their treatment as good or excellent, and decades later, thousands still remembered the taste of white bread, the sight of neon signs glowing in small-town streets, the sound of choirs singing Stille Nacht on a Texas Christmas. The lesson endures. Wars are not won only with courage or tactics, but with logistics, with production, with the ability to make abundance, and perhaps most of all, with the strength to show humanity even to enemies. When Joachim Peiper stood among 50,000 gallons of captured American fuel in December 1944, he thought he had found salvation. In truth, he had found a prophecy. That abundance, so casual to the Americans and so miraculous to him, was the proof Germany's war was already lost. The Tiger tanks abandoned in Belgian snow, their gauges frozen on empty, remain monuments to that truth. Powerful machines undone not by shells, but by scarcity. Beside them, American engines roared forward, drowning Europe in steel, gasoline, and food. The Germans had fought with valor, training, even fanaticism. But America fought with oceans of oil, mountains of wheat, endless rivers of trucks, ships, and planes, and with a quiet confidence that allowed them to treat their enemies with dignity. The result was not only military victory, but transformation. The men who marched home from American captivity carried seeds of democracy that would bloom into a new Germany, allied instead of hostile, free instead of enslaved, prosperous instead of desperate. Their story proves a final, enduring truth. The greatest victories are not won through destruction, but through demonstration. Not through fear, but through example. Not through tyranny, but through freedom. The German prisoners arrived believing in Hitler's dream. They left believing in something far greater, that the true arsenal of democracy was not just weapons, but the simple, overwhelming evidence of a free society's ability to create abundance and extend humanity, even to its enemies. And in that lesson lay the foundation of a better world.